Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our program today on how to avoid, get out of the new nuclear arms race. I'm Charles Shapiro, President of World Affairs Council. Our guests today are former Secretary of Defense William Perry and Tom Collina, Director of Policy at the Ploughshares Fund. Today's program is brought to you through the support of the members of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta and your donations. With the academic year starting, we're delighted to have so many university students and professors with us today. I'd like to especially welcome Dr. Carrie Lee and a number of her colleagues from the U.S. Air War College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. Dr. William Perry is a mathematician, engineer, businessman, civil servant who was the 19th U.S. Secretary of Defense from 1994 to 1997. As part of the U.S. Army of Occupation in Japan, then Army Sergeant Bill Perry saw firsthand the rubble of Hiroshima. Dr. Perry, a professor emeritus at Stanford, has devoted his retirement to writing and warning the world about the dangers of the new nuclear arms race. Tom Collina is Director of Policy at the Ploughshares Fund and co-author with Dr. Perry of The Button, The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump, a book which you may want to go online and buy. Tom Collina has worked extensively as a researcher, analyst, and advocate to end U.S. nuclear testing, rationalize anti-missile programs, and to promote arms control. So Dr. Perry, I'm going to ask you the first question. You say that our nuclear weapons policy is obsolete and dangerous. I know. I helped to design it, and we have to change it before it's too late. So let me start with the very beginning. How is our policy obsolete?
Primarily because we are focused on the wrong threat. We believe both implicitly and explicitly that the real danger is that Russia is going to attack the United States in a surprise attack with their nuclear weapons, just as we believed during the Cold War. And our policies are based on that. Unfortunately, the policies tend to aggravate the real danger, which is that we will blunder into a nuclear war.
And when you say blunder, you mean United States, Russia? How many countries have nuclear weapons?
Well, 9 countries have nuclear weapons, but I worry mostly about Russia and the United States in terms of blundering into a nuclear war.
Tom, how does the current system work?
So the scenario we're worried about is, imagine that the president gets an alarm that there's a Russian attack on the way. And the president would have just a few minutes to decide whether that attack is real and what to do about it. But we've had false alarms before, as Secretary Perry will tell you. We've had multiple false alarms. And we think that today, given cyber security risks, there's even a greater risk of false alarms of nuclear attack. And what most people don't realize is that our command and control system, our early warning system, is networked and computer-based, and therefore is hackable. So if the president gets a warning in the middle of the night that an attack is coming, we think it's more likely that that attack would be false than real, that someone could be hacking in, or it could be a mistake or a false alarm caused by a number of other reasons. And the worst thing that could happen would be for the president to make a quick decision to respond to that alarm with a U.S. retaliation, and then only later to find that the attack wasn't real, and we would have then started nuclear war by mistake.
How does our launch authority work in the U.S.? I mean, who has the power to launch nuclear weapons?
So it's the president. The president of the United States has the sole authority to launch all U.S. nuclear weapons within minutes. And this is something most Americans don't realize. Polls show that most Americans think that the president would have to consult with Congress or with the Secretary of Defense or some other entity. But in fact, it is the sole authority of the president and the president alone. And that's what gives us great concern, because numerous presidents have shown that they are frankly not up to the job, and at any moment in time in particular may not be up to the job. President Trump being impulsive, not listening to his advisors, but we don't want to focus on President Trump here. There have been other presidents, for example, President Nixon, who is known to be drinking late in his time in office. And more broadly, we would say that no president, no human can really handle and should be given that much authority to make a quick decision when so little information is at hand. It's simply dangerous, and we don't need to do it. It's one of those leftover Cold War policies that may have made sense during the Cold War, but it doesn't make sense anymore.
Okay, so I grew up, went to university, and worked at the State Department during the Cold War, and our whole policy was based on the way to deter a strike is by having that second strike ability. That is, that the Soviets, the Russians, would know that if they launched weapons at the US, we would destroy them. Are you taking that out of the picture? We should just absorb a first strike? I mean, that seems pretty counterintuitive, Dr. Perry.
Let me ask Tom to answer that one, and I'll comment on it.
Okay.
Well, it is counterintuitive, but Charles, I guess I would ask it to you this way. If a first strike were coming from Russia and the president were to launch within minutes before the weapons got here, our response would not stop that first strike. So we would be absorbing the Russian strike either way. And what we're saying is it would be better to wait and see if it's a real attack than to launch based on warning of attack that could be a false alarm. Because again, the thing we think is the highest probability here is a false alarm. And so if the president launches, we know what it is, we will have started, the United States will have started nuclear war by mistake, and we can't think of a worse scenario than that.
Charles, I just want to add to that, that we're certainly not taking deterrence out of the picture, by no means. We advocate maintaining a strong deterrence. What we don't advocate is responding to an alarm in a matter of minutes, because history shows that that alarm could be a false alarm. So, and that's not, to me, theoretical. To me, I've actually experienced false alarms. Most importantly, when I was the Undersecretary of Defense during the Cold War, I was actually awoken at 3 o'clock in the morning by the watch officer of the North American Air Defense Command. He was telling me that his computer was showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. Now, believe me, I woke up very fast when I heard that. He quickly added, happily, that he had determined that his computers were wrong, was a false alarm. And he was calling me to see if I could help him figure out what the hell was going wrong with his computers. The sequel to that story is that we took us a couple of days to determine that. It was just a simple, stupid little microchip in the computer, which is malfunctioning. An earlier false alarm that I had a year earlier than that, it was a human error. That, in this case, the new operator coming on watch that night mistakenly put in the simulating tape to the computer instead of the operating tape. And it was showing a very realistic attack underway. So machines still err, humans still err, and so we're still vulnerable to false alarms, of which I know about 5 that have happened so in our history, and we will have more.
What, from your perspective, what would be the best, a better system? I mean, how should it work? Should the president have sole launch authority? If he should consult, whom should he consult with and when? I mean, how would it work in an ideal world?
Well, there are many ways of organizing it so that it's less dangerous than it is right now. The main problem is that we have fixed in our mind that we had to have a quick response, had to be able to quickly launch. And in my judgment, the quick launch is a problem, not an asset, because it's the quick launches which makes it susceptible to false launching, to accidentally starting a nuclear war. We do not have to launch quickly. What we have to do is be sure, before we launch, we have to be sure we're right. And we cannot determine that ordinarily in 5 minutes without consultation, without discussion. We need much more thought and concern and analysis before we actually start a nuclear war. We should know there's no reason to rush into ending civilization. Let's think it over before we do it.
And Charles, if I could just maybe give the 3 top recommendations we have for reducing the false alarm danger or the quick launch danger. The first would be to remove presidential sole authority from the president. So the president would share that authority with Congress, which would reduce the risk of a quick launch. And people would say, well, of course, then that's going to slow down the process. And we would say, yes, exactly right. We want to slow down the process. We don't see the value in having a quick launch. The second main recommendation would be to end our first use policy. Most Americans don't know this either, that the United States president can launch nuclear weapons first, even if there's no nuclear attack incoming. I think most Americans feel that we have a deterrence only policy, that we would only launch in response to an attack, but that's not true. We have a first launch policy. So we would have the president end that first launcher policy. And third, we would want the United States has 3 different types of nuclear delivery systems: sea-based, air-based, and land-based. And we would phase out the land-based ballistic missiles, the ICBMs, because these are the most vulnerable weapons, and they're the weapons that the president would feel pressure to use quickly if there were an alarm of attack. So we see these as a danger, as an accident waiting to happen, and that the land-based missiles should be phased out.
A little bit of explanation for me and for the audience. Why are land-based missiles so vulnerable?
Well, they're located in silos. And we built those silos originally with lots of concrete around them. We built them to protect the missiles so that they were not vulnerable. But over the years after that, both we and the Soviet Union and now Russia have made their ICBMs more and more accurate. And so today, our ICBMs and their ICBMs can destroy the silos as they sit. So the silos no longer protect the missiles. And in each case, both in Russia and the United States, the location of the silos is precisely known to both sides. So they're sitting ducks, really. They're absolutely sitting ducks. The only way to protect the ICBM them is to launch it before the attack occurs. In other words, quick launch. That's why we have the quick launch policy.
Without the land-based missiles, would we have enough nuclear warheads if we were to enter into some sort of engagement with the Russians?
The short answer is yes, more than enough. We have many submarines at sea. Any one of those submarines has enough nuclear firepower in it to completely destroy any country in the world. One submarine equals the destruction of one country. So yes, we have more than enough. Not to mention the fact we also have nuclear bombers.
Why do you not advocate I'm asking this on behalf of our Air Force colleagues, who probably are, delighted you're not advocating getting rid of the bombers. I mean, why are the bombers not as vulnerable as land-based missiles? I mean,
well,
they're sitting on runways.
If they're sitting on their bases, of course they are, and therefore that's not our primary our deterrence response. Our submarines, as I see it, are our primary response. But if we were in a crisis, if we had any reason to believe we were under attack, we could put our airplanes on airborne patrol, as we did it early in the Cold War. There are many reasons for not doing that, but we could do that in a crisis, and that would make them also reduce their vulnerability.
I'm going to stop here and encourage the audience to please send questions using the question and answer function. It's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please make your questions short, to the point, and have them end in a question mark, because they will make it easier for me as the moderators. And in a few minutes, we'll go to your questions. I'm not sure who this should go to, but how do we, I mean, I know you're working at it, but it certainly seems that the American population, it's maybe the world population, isn't paying attention to this. Is the fact that we've not had a nuclear weapon deployed since 1945 and that the Soviet Union no longer exists means that people don't really worry about this. When I was young, we did. How do you get people to worry about this issue?
I think it's a great question, and it's a real challenge, and it's frankly why we wrote the book and why we're holding events like this is to raise awareness. But I think there's two specific entry points that make it easier today for people to get engaged in nuclear policy issues. One is the issue of presidential sole authority. And here we are having an election come up, which raises that question, right? Who do you want to have their finger on the button? Our answer is neither Trump nor Biden, right? Our answer is no one should have their finger on the button. We should get rid of the button. So we're hoping that that as an issue can resonate. The other is that, you know, as a country, we're facing a huge crisis right now, whether it be the economy, COVID-19, racial injustice, a huge amount of problems that the next president will have to address. All of those problems will cost a lot of money, climate change, for example, and we're going to have a budget crisis. And so I think this is another entry point for the public to say, you know, how do we solve this budget crisis? How do we redirect our federal spending? And to us, part of that is to take money out of programs that are not serving our country well, for example, nuclear weapons. And back on this issue of the land-based ballistic missiles, the United States is planning to spend $1 trillion on nuclear weapons over the next 30 years. A big chunk of that, $100 billion, would go to a new generation of land-based ballistic missiles. Well, as we are saying, those weapons are actually making us less safe. Wouldn't it be a good idea to take that money and transfer it into something we really need to do, like respond to the coronavirus? And this is something that we hope that the next administration, the next president will take seriously. How do we redirect our federal dollars to be more effective in protecting Americans?
Okay, so on Tuesday, Secretary of State Pompeo said, America left a harmful treaty so our nation can now build missiles to deter Russian aggression. What I hear you saying is we should not be building missiles to deter Russian aggression. I mean, how do you square that? Is it not inevitable that there would be a U.S.-Russia arms race?
Well, we hope it's not inevitable, and in fact, we want to stop the next arms race. I mean, if you look at the experience of the first arms race during the Cold War, you know, we both had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, an insane amount of weaponry, and we spent trillions of dollars to get it, and it didn't make us less safe. So I'm sorry, it did make us less safe. So let's not do that again. Let's learn the lesson here that an arms race is a really bad idea. But at the same time, we're not saying don't deter Russia. We're saying do enough to deter Russia, but no more than that. And we don't think the ICBMs, the land-based missiles, are needed to deter Russia because, as we said, we still have the subs, we still have the bombers. That's plenty.
The Russians, Vladimir Putin, talk about the hypersonic cruise missiles. And it sounds so science fiction. I mean, is that real? How do you counter that? Are we doing the same thing? Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about that. Not only the Russian hypersonic cruise missile, but because they're doing it, of course, we have to do it as well. So we're going to have a hypersonic. It's just one element of what's called a nuclear arms race. It's stupid, basically stupid. It's advertised as it's wonder weapon because it cannot be stopped, it cannot be defeated. Well, neither can the ICBMs. I mean, really, the ICBMs, we have no viable defense for a Russian ICBM attack, and the Russians have no viable defense for our ICBM attack. So we already have an offensive weapon, the ICBMs, which cannot be stopped by the other country. So the big hype on the hypersonics, which is they cannot be defended against, is silly because we already have weapons that cannot be defended against, and they're called ICBMs. Anybody that tells me that our country can defend against a mass ICBM attack from Russia or vice versa is deluded, that's all.
Okay, and the footnote here is ICBM is intercontinental ballistic missiles. They are the missiles fired from one country that multiple stages hit the other country, right?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Let's set aside U.S. and Russia for a minute. Why do we not hear more about China, nuclear threat from China? I mean, we hear every day how China is becoming the other superpower and is a strategic rival to the United States. Is it not a nuclear rival with U.S.?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of exaggeration of the Chinese threat. I mean, it's real. China has about 300 nuclear weapons, only about a fraction of which can reach the United States. But that is just a fraction of the weapons that the United States and Russia has, right? Depending on how you count it, the United States has about 10 to 20 times the nuclear arsenal of China. So it's simply not.
Back up for a minute. How many nuclear warheads does the United States possess?
About 6,000, about the same number as Russia.
6,000.
6,000. And China has about 300, but most of those are short range systems. They're not going to get over here. But again, however you count it, it's at least 10 times and as much as 20 times smaller, the Chinese arsenal. So, but even so, we have the Trump administration right now, I would say, exaggerating the Chinese threat, using China as an excuse why the Trump administration is not extending the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the New START Treaty, which is the only treaty left that controls U.S. and Russian nuclear forces. We would like to see the Trump administration extend that treaty right now with Russia. It wouldn't take ratification by the Senate. It could be done very quickly. But instead, the Trump administration is using China as an excuse not to do that. That's a real problem. And so we're hoping that whoever the next president is, they will get on this right away.
Just to clarify, Charles, we have only 1,550 long-range missiles, ICBMs, actually deployed under the New START Treaty, and the same for Russia. But each of us has several thousand more of these missiles in reserve.
I mean, it sounds amazing. I mean, I can't imagine finding that many targets in each other's country with the destruction of a nuclear weapon.
No,
well, just to clarify, also to emphasize that point, when the last year or so of President Obama's presidency, he proposed to unilaterally reduce our 1,550 deployed weapons to 1,000, which is still way more than needed for deterrence. But there was a firestorm in that, and he backed away from it and did not go through with it. So you and I may believe that 1,000 weapons is more than enough needed for deterrence, but many people do not. Well, perhaps more importantly, they don't measure how many missiles we should have by deterrent. They measure it by keeping up with the Joneses. In other words, it's a parity issue. It's a psychological issue rather than it is a military issue.
And I would just add to that the climate science tells us that if we use 100 or so large nuclear weapons on cities, that could be enough to start a nuclear winter scenario that would likely end civilization as we know it. So it would take much fewer nuclear weapons than we have today to cause great, great destruction.
Explain real briefly what nuclear winter means, because I think most people on this call don't know.
So the scenario would be if either country, say, used 100 large nuclear weapons on the other cities, that would create so much fire and smoke, and the smoke would go up into the upper atmosphere over time and essentially block out the sun. So you'd have, of course, the initial destruction of the blasts and the fire and the heat that would kill millions of people. But then over time, you would have less sunshine. And then the crops would not grow. And then you would have famine as a result. And then this smoke would, because it's so high up in the atmosphere, would basically spread around the world. So, I mean, that's the doomsday scenario that we have to take seriously.
So that's climate change on steroids.
Yes, it is.
Okay. It's an extinction event, conceivably, comparable to when the asteroid hit the planet 66 million years ago and caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. In that case, the extinction was due to a natural event. But now we have the capability to bring about our own extinction if we care to do so.
this is an upbeat discussion. I mean, two other issues real quick. I say real quick, none of these are quick. India, Pakistan seems particularly unstable. Both countries have nuclear weapons. And then there's also, I mean, the issue of a dirty bomb, of terrorists somehow getting in their hands enough uranium to put together a bomb, not big, but big enough to create a huge mess. I mean, can y'all talk about both of those? I'm asking you to do it quickly. I mean, gosh.
Well, I'll talk about South Asia, and then Bill, you can talk about the dirty bomb. The point I like to make about South Asia is, yes, it's a real concern that India and Pakistan are facing off with nuclear weapons. They've been at war before. It's a very unstable region. And the weapons themselves may be unstable in terms of their protection. But we tend to think of them as a bilateral situation that can be solved kind of in a bubble all by itself. And it's simply not true, because we have to realize that the reason why these countries have weapons is because the other countries have weapons, right? And Pakistan looks at India as its competitor, but India looks at China and as a regional competitor. And China, of course, is looking at Russia and the United States. So this is all connected. And if we want to solve the South Asia problem, we have to start at home.
On the dirty bomb, it's not in the same category at all in terms of potential catastrophe. If a terrorist got a real nuclear bomb, say a Hiroshima bomb size, he could do the damage that we did in Hiroshima by dropping the bombs to destroy a city effectively. But a dirty bomb is a different category altogether. It's when a terrorist gets a hold of cesium, say, steals it from a hospital, and mixes it in with some high explosives and explodes it, puts it in a truck and takes it downtown and explodes it. That could kill maybe a few hundred people. It could spread radiation material over many blocks, and those blocks would be non-usable for a long time. So it's a disruptive effect, to be sure, but not anything like the mass destruction that could be done by a nuclear bomb. So it's in a different league altogether.
Okay, I've got questions from the audience, and I'm going to try to ask them quickly and hopefully get some shorter answers, although everything seems pretty hard and pretty complicated. Maybe go find the one I was just looking at. It looks great. This is from John Wood. In light of the fact the U.S. has walked away from a whole bunch of treaties with Russia and begun development of ground-based strategic deterrent, and Russia's in the process of deploying new intermediate range missiles, intercontinental missiles, and the supersonic cruise missile. Isn't some sort of arms race between our two countries inevitable? And is the U.S. lagging behind?
It's probable, but not inevitable. It'd be my answer. But it's probable because the psychology and the politics are driving us to do whatever the Russians do and vice versa. That's part of the answer. Tom, do you want to add to that?
Right, and the actions we take will determine whether it's going to happen or not. So, for example, I'll go back to the land-based ballistic missiles. If we decide not to build those, then that's a powerful message that we're sending to Russia that we want to stop this process. We want to stop this arms race. And again, we're not saying we want to give up all our nukes unilaterally. We will still have plenty on bombers and subs for deterrence, but we want to cut this arms race process short. We want to stop it in its tracks because we know from experience, from having done this before, that we're all losers if we do this.
Just to add to that, Charles, the last nuclear arms race we had created dynamics that led to us, between the two of us, having more than 60,000 nuclear weapons. 60,000. My class sometimes asks me, why in the world do we get 60,000 nuclear weapons? Why do we need 60,000 nuclear weapons for deterrence? And the answer, of course, is we didn't. It was just a stupid political process got underway and could not be controlled.
Just to add to that, I mean, people often think that there's a logic to nuclear policy, and sometimes there is, but sometimes there isn't. And the fact that we had over 60,000 nuclear weapons together during the Cold War should be enough evidence to show that not all nuclear policy makes sense.
Richard Sanders, a retired FSO, asks, if Russia knows we will delay the nuclear response, won't they be able to destroy command and control capability of the United States before we can launch and thus render our deterrent ineffective?
Well, the short answer is no. Tom, will you give the longer answer?
Well, no. So let's imagine that the president wisely decides not to respond to an alarm. Let's say unlikely the alarm turns out to be real and we are attacked with nuclear weapons. None of those weapons will be able to destroy all of the submarines that we have out at sea. So those submarines will still be there to deal devastation within hours to the Russians and the entire Russian society. And Russia knows this. You know, Russians are rational people. They're not, at least their leadership is not suicidal. We may not like Russia's policies. We may wish that Russia would change their policies, but they're not suicidal. They're not irrational. So we have no reason to expect that they would launch an attack, which they would have every reason to expect would be the end of their country as they know it.
Dr. Carrie Lee from the Air War College asks, we've seen enormous partisan gridlock over even the most basic measures and legislation. Your solution would require both the president and congressional leaders to agree to a massive retaliatory strike in the event of a nuclear launch. Is this realistic?
So a couple of points. One is a lot, you know, U.S. nuclear policy is driven by the president. These are the president's weapons. So a president could, on his own authority, declare no first use, a no first use policy, could share authority for sole authority with Congress, and could move to phase out land-based ballistic missiles. Yes, it would be good to have congressional support for these things, but I believe if a president led boldly in these areas, a president could get it done, particularly if there was public support for these policies. And part of the reason we're doing this is we think it's essential that there be public support, because as we saw with the Obama administration, you know, even a determined president runs into limits of what they can get done without the public support to make it happen.
Byron Stokes from Georgia Tech asks, he notes, first of all, that you are his personal hero, so take that with you. He asks, how are cyber vulnerabilities affecting nuclear strategy?
That's a wonderful question. Tom, I'm going to give you a crack at that. It's a great question.
So cyber, I would say, is the new wild card in the deck. And cyber is part of the reason why we're so concerned about false alarms, and that we think false alarms are becoming more likely. Because as most people don't realize, our nuclear command and control and warning systems are all networked through computers. Therefore, despite what anybody tells you in the nuclear bureaucracy, they're vulnerable to cyber attack. We don't know when, we don't know how, but they're vulnerable. And so any alert, any warning of an incoming attack could be false. And that's why we say uncategorically that a president should assume any alarm is a false alarm until proven otherwise. And this is because of the risk of cyber hacks, and it's because of the history we know that we've had false alarms before.
Kwang Suk Lee asks, and I'm going to change this question around a little bit, but could the same cyber vulnerabilities affect our ability to communicate with our submarines in the case of a nuclear attack?
Well, I mean, the communications with the submarines are by radio. So, you know, I don't really know the answer to that question, other than to say it could delay the communication, but it's not going to make the submarines go away. And again, someone smarter than me once said that a failure to communicate is not a failure to retaliate. So even if in the event of nuclear war, we lost the ability to communicate with the subs are still there. And the sub commanders will make their decision about what to do. You know, they're not going to retire in a nuclear war and go live in Tahiti someplace. They're going to weigh for themselves whether they want to launch those weapons back at Russia, and Russia cannot control that.
Yeah. I've got a couple of variations on questions on North Korea. I mean, what should we be doing? How concerned should we be? How do we handle it? It certainly appears to me that none of the last 4 administrations have handled North Korea particularly well. And what would y'all recommend?
I would say, first of all, that we tried very hard to keep North Korea from getting nuclear weapons. And we should have succeeded, but we failed. And I won't go into the finger pointing of why we failed on that, but we could have succeeded. They have them now. They have a small, medium-sized nuclear arsenal. That's the bad news. The good news is that they're not stupid either, and they're not suicidal. They have those weapons primarily because they want to keep the regime in power. It's regime survival, say. Well, they don't get regime survival if they use the nuclear weapons. They can only be useful for deterrence. So they're looking for their weapons for deterrence too. They're not going to be lashing out and using the nuclear weapons in an unprovoked attack. So it's not good news that they have nuclear weapons. What is good news, though, is that those weapons are for deterrence. That's the way they would be. They view them. That's the way they would be used. And therefore, we do not need, I believe, to be concerned about an unprovoked attack, nuclear attack by North Korea on South Korea or Japan or the United States even. But I deeply regret that our diplomacy failed to stop those from happening. I personally spent many years on that problem myself, and I believe we could have succeeded. But that's too long an issue to go into here.
That's for another conversation, so I'm going to have to invite y'all back. Can you talk about a new or revived strategic defense initiative? This is from Tom Welsh. Is it technically feasible? Would it increase or decrease stability of the current balance of terror?
Are you talking about missile defense? Is that the question?
Yeah. In our book, we have a chapter devoted to that, which I would recommend that the questioner read carefully. But the bottom line of it is that no, against a sophisticated adversary with a good sized nuclear force, there's no missile defense system that exists or really that we can conceive of today that could stop that attack. They could shoot down maybe a few of the missiles, maybe dozens of the missiles, but they could not stop a deterrent attack. Partly because we have too many, we and the Russians have too many nuclear weapons that could be used in the attack. But also beyond that is that each side has and could use decoys. And so what could be an attack of 200, 300 warheads could also include 2,000, 5,000 decoys. And our missile defense systems are fundamentally vulnerable to those decoys because, without getting into detail, they operate in outer space and free space, where it's very difficult to discriminate between a decoy and a warhead. So the short answer is you cannot defend against a large-scale attack by a sophisticated opponent who is smart enough and clever enough to have decoys.
Just to add to that, and I agree with everything that Secretary Baker just said, in addition to the defenses, strategic defenses not being effective, they do serve to spook the Russians because we're spending so much money on this system. The Russian worst case analysis is, oh, what if these things work? Maybe not today, but someday. And so as a response, we're going to keep our forces at a certain level. In other words, we're not going to reduce too low because of our concern that the Americans might figure out missile defense. So we've essentially created a floor below which the Russians may not go, and that's not in our security interest.
Well, I've talked to Russians about this many times, very sophisticated Russians. They understand what I've just told you, namely that we cannot defend against their system and they cannot defend against our systems. But they have this image of the Americans as being 10 feet tall, technically. And they just say, what if someday the Americans will really come up with a viable missile defense? What if? So that worry is always in the back of their minds. And that influences what they do. And in particular, it influences them to want to keep large missile forces, which is not to our advantage.
John Wood asked, what about space-based weapons? Is that something we should be concerned about?
It's very, very much concerned about. The last thing we want is for either any country to have space-based to attack us, space-based systems. The United States, more than any country in the world, depends on our satellites for all sorts of functions, for communications, navigation, on and on. Our GPS systems, for example, are all satellite systems, all of which are vulnerable to attack. So the last thing we want is for somebody to start a space war. In particular, the last thing we should be doing is suggesting that we're into that ourselves, and therefore stimulate other countries to do the same thing.
We're reaching the end of our time, so let me ask you this question. I mean, you have described so many nightmares. What keeps you up at night? What are you most concerned about?
A mistake, a blunder, blundering into a nuclear war. I do not worry about Russia or Korea or Iran launching nuclear weapons at us. I worry about some political miscalculation or technical mistake or a lapse of sanity on the part of leaders, which would lead us to somehow cause a nuclear war to start. So that's what I worry about, is a blunder.
Wow, thank you so much. Secretary William Perry, Tom Collina, this has been terrific. We're going to put the video of this on YouTube, and I hope you will share it, and everybody in the audience, I hope you'll look at it and share it. Also encourage you all to go to the Ploughshares website. They've got a great deal of material to be appropriate for teachers to use. Got video clips, great information for all of us to use. Be sure and buy their book. I want to encourage everybody to tell you, we, the World Affairs Council, we need your help. Please join the World Affairs Council, renew your membership, make a donation. We're working online, doing our programming for free, and it's a bit of a squeeze. Next week on September 2nd, we have Brett Lacey, Associate Director of Democracy Programs at the Carter Center, talking about protecting elections at home and abroad. I hope to see you then. I want to thank the World Affairs Council staff, Fernanda Lucchini, Executive Director, Valerin Lopez DeFrank, our Business Manager, Ladarian Gillette, the producer of these programs. And I want to thank Zach Brown from the Ploughshares Fund, who's worked out all the technical issues and been the go-between. So I want to thank you all. Dr. Perry, Tom Collina, thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and I appreciate the time you devoted to us.
Charles, I want to thank you for the very well-informed and intelligent moderating you did of this discussion. It was very useful to us. I also want to add to the recommendation to read the book is that go to atthebrink.org. We have a podcast, which is in its sixth season right now. So go to that podcast, you'll get some very interesting background information. It's easier than reading the book, I might say, but it's not instead of, but in addition to reading the book, atthebrink.org.
So buy the book and go to the podcast. Got it. Tom, you get the last word.
Thank you very much again for running this great session. And for those who do want to buy the book, go to benbellabooks.com. And if you use the code button30, button30, you will get 30% off. And we really appreciate it.
That's the best tip of the day. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.